Welcome to the Grizzly Beat, a podcast of Grizzly Times and Louisa Wilcox, where we interview scientific experts, managers, Native Americans, writers, and others to share their knowledge, perspectives, and experience. This comes at a time of enormous interest in the grizzly bear's future as the government proposes to remove federal protections, and citizens are asking important questions. We hope the information shared here will help listeners shape their own answers.
So, this is Louisa Wilcox with Grizzly Times, and we're here with Dr. Rob Wielgus, who has done a massive amount of large carnivore work on the effects of hunting on lions, wolves, grizzly bears, and many other topics. He's had a rough time recently speaking truth to power with his science, and we're here to learn more about that experience. But he's had a long and very auspicious and successful career that's directly relevant to imminent hunting of grizzlies in Yellowstone and ongoing hunting of wolves as well. So welcome, Rob.
Hi, thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So you've been studying large carnivores like wolves and grizzlies and mountain lions and their prey for over 35 years. Maybe you can share a story from your early life that sparked your curiosity about wildlife.
Well, geez, my curiosity about wildlife was my mother. We lived on the outskirts of Winnipeg. We were the kind of the last house, and right across the street was forest and wetland and everything. And my mom would take me out, and we'd go bird watching and watch the deer and lynx and stuff like that. And so I was always in the bush, built a fort in the woods, and just played in the woods. It was my sanctuary. So that's how it all started. And eventually I found out that one could actually make a career living and working in the woods. And so I decided early on that I would get into the wildlife profession. While I was in high school, I decided that I would become a wildlife biologist.
And you went on to study at University of British Columbia.
Yes.
With a very prominent scientist, Fred Bunnell,
yes.
Who you published a number of papers with. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how that experience shaped your view of science and research.
Well, Fred was a great mentor. He really kind of shaped where my lab went later. So when I was with Fred, we worked in what he called the Center for Applied Conservation Biology. So it was science and hard science, but supporting conservation. And so everything, it wasn't esoteric. None of the research programs there were, just kind of basic natural history or anything like that. Everything incorporated natural history and science and evolution, but it was all focused towards conservation. And so that's where I got my, the really applied aspect of my research. Mm-hmm. And so after working with Fred for a number of years, and I saw how successful he was at using science in the political arena to advance conservation biology, I decided to emulate that when I ended up going to Washington State University and started the Large Carnivore Conservation Lab, which is basically an offshoot of Fred Bunnell's Center for Applied Conservation Biology, except focused on large carnivores.
Well, that lab seemed unique in this country anyway. I mean, with your focus and all the graduate students you had running around, studying large carnivores. And a lot of your studies were on very rare ones.
Right.
The mountain lions, wolves, grizzly bears, and such. And a lot of their scarcity has to do with extreme hostility on the part of Europeans when they hit the North American shores, expressed through, trapping and poisoning and hunting and in the case of wolves, even burning forests down where they lived, which really sounds extreme now. But how important do you think laws like the Endangered Species Act, which are built on science, have improved conditions for some of those carnivores that have been so persecuted over the years?
Well, enormously. I don't think we would have grizzly bears here without the ESA. We wouldn't have them in the lower 48. We certainly wouldn't have wolves here in the lower 48. It's worked for them. Unfortunately, it didn't work out all that well for endangered mountain caribou, the last population in northern Idaho that I worked on. That population, it looks like it's been extirpated. But for the most part, for large carnivores, it's been pretty darn successful. Again, the caribou is different because the population was very small to begin with. It was already in the demographic trap, with about 30 individuals or less. And once you get to that number, the cards are not in your favor anymore. Chances are the population will be extirpated.
Right.
That's what's happened with caribou.
Well, it's not unlike what's happening now with the Kavanaugh grizzly bear, or even the northern Selkirk's grizzly bear, or for sure the North Cascades bears, which not much is said about. But
right.
you were just speaking about the demographic trap of when you get to such low numbers, you're sort of doomed.
It's very difficult. I worked on the Selkirk Mountain grizzly bears for years and years.
Right.
And, it's a constant battle to keep that population viable because of the low numbers and the small area that's reserved for them. But I'm hopeful that eventually we will achieve some degree of recovery for the Selkirk Mountains grizzly bears.
Mm-hmm. What's your take from your long experience with the Endangered Species Act in terms of our evolution as a society and culture?
Well, I think, when we instituted that law, it just shows that, we're progressive in thinking about other animals rather than just ourselves, kind of taking kind of a native Indian approach to these kind of things, thinking that, oh, look, these animals deserve to be on this planet just as much as we do. So the ESA was very progressive in formalizing that in legal means that animals have a right to exist in this country. So, it's really progressive in that regard. And, I sure hope it stays.
Yes, it's under serious threat more than it's been in many years.
Yeah, it's looking pretty bad. I'm very frightened that Congress will simply do away with it. And, and then that could be the end of grizzly bears and wolves and wolverines and lynx and all kinds of carnivores and other animals as well.
I sadly agree with you. I think that has been the lifeline for all of those species for so long. And for the majority of the American public who cares about the Act, every time the public is polled about what they think, they support the Act. And yet we have a Congress who doesn't seem to care what most people think. No,
it's pretty sad that, again, the vast majority of Americans are supportive of the ESA, but certain special interests aren't, and so it's under assault.
Mm-hmm. So in addition to studying things like grizzlies and mountain caribou and mountain lions and wolves in the United States and Canada, you've also done work in Europe, in the Pyrenees. Maybe you could compare your experience in Europe with what you found in the U.S.
Well, some of the things were pretty similar. I worked on recovery of Pyrenees brown bears, which is basically grizzly bears, same thing, Ursus arctos. And we examined that population to find out what was limiting it and what was preventing that population from recovering. And what we found was that the sex ratio was heavily skewed towards males. The population was very small. So we recommended that female bears be brought in from Slovenia because they were the closest genetic match to these bears. And actually, it was done. The European Union and the government of France and Spain said, sure, let's do this. And we brought in Slovenian brown bears. And the population has since been growing and thriving and recovering. So that was a great success. I enjoyed working on recovery of Pyrenean brown bears a great deal. I didn't enjoy so much living in Paris for some periods of time, but I really liked living and working in the Pyrenees. So that was a success in Europe. Some other things that I've seen, though, in contrast, to what we have here. For example, in Italy, there's more wolves in the very small country of Italy than there is in the entire lower 48. So they have considerably more wolves than we have, with a much higher human density. But at the same time, there is no lethal control of wolves. There's no need for it. They use non-lethal means, and it's been entirely successful. Right. So we could learn from countries like Italy on how to coexist with wolves. They have an extensive program for cowboys in Italy, and the cowboys are kind of dressed up in fancy regalia, and they're very well respected, and people want to be cowboys in Italy,
right.
and so it's working. They have plenty of cowboys in Italy, and most of ours are in Hollywood. So I think we could follow their lead.
That's great. That's yes, I think it is a lot to learn from Europe. I mean, they got 6,000 brown bears in Romania,
Sure.
and we whine in the lower 48 states about 1,500, 1,800 brown bears in isolated populations, and yet here they are. They've been coexisting with these animals for thousands of years.
Yeah, it's amazing that you can see in Europe large carnivores and people can coexist. Yeah, even in these much smaller countries with much higher human densities.
Right.
All it takes is a little bit of thought and scientific guidance, and then following through on that scientific guidance rather than ignoring it.
Right, which is everything.
Yeah.
I mean, speaking of which, and ignoring scientific guidance is a question about a lot of work that you've done on the science about the impact of hunting on livestock-related conflicts with people and large carnivores. And you reported in your findings in some of the most prestigious scientific journals there are. And what you found was really counterintuitive, that livestock depredation tends to increase with hunted large carnivore populations. In some cases, hunting doesn't decrease, but actually increases local densities of local populations of carnivores. Maybe you can explain how that is.
Yeah, sure. Most of these carnivores are territorial and self-regulating. For example, my work on cougars with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife that we did for some 15 years, we found that when you remove a resident adult male cougar through hunting, then you have a vacant territory, and then typically 3 younger males from adjacent areas will quickly actually move into the area. And so instead of dealing with one older male cougar, and cougars don't get old by causing trouble, you've got 3 younger males, and these research has shown that it's the younger males that typically prey on livestock. So basically, what we found was that removing these male cougars tripled the risk of livestock depredation. Indeed, we found that throughout the state of Washington, that removing cougars in excess of 12 to 14% per year resulted in really high livestock depredation rates. And so what we did in Washington State, because of that, we limited cougar mortality to 14% or less in any game management unit to prevent this immigration of young males from pouring into any given area. And the livestock depredations have dramatically decreased as a result of that program. So we found that, social disruption of carnivores resulted in increased livestock depredation, increased complaints, and increased depredations on pets. So as a result of that work on cougars that was really successful in reducing, cougar complaints and livestock depredations and so on, then I was appointed by the state legislature to be the lead on wolf livestock problems in the state, and begin a research program there to see if we could find the same type of answers, find out what's going on, why depredations occur, and how we could mitigate them and reduce them. And my initial research found kind of the same kind of result, but for different reasons. It appears that when you're, fracturing a pack, not if you kill the entire pack. Of course, if you kill the entire pack, there won't be any further depredations from that pack. And we showed that. What we found, though, that if you're killing wolves at greater than 25% per year, in other words, you're removing a quarter of the population, the depredations will go down because the maximum growth rate of wolves is 25% per year. But if you're killing them at less than that rate, and you can't kill them at that rate indefinitely because, they'd simply be extirpated, we found if you're killing them at less than that rate, you're fracturing the pack. And so you have an alpha male, alpha female, or the breeding pair, and they suppress breeding in the rest of the pack. Well, if the pack is fragmented, you could end up with 2 breeding pairs instead of 1, or sometimes even 3 breeding pairs instead of 1. And our research and research of others have shown that breeding pairs are the wolves that are responsible for the vast majority of livestock depredations, because they're tied to the den site. They can't follow their natural prey like deer and elk as they migrate. Right. They're just stuck at the den site, and if livestock are at the den site, the wolves will take them if that's the only prey available. So the explanation there was, at least my interpretation, was this pack fragmentation could result in increased breeding pairs and increased livestock depredation. Those results were not well received in the Republican political environment of Washington State.
Well, maybe you can describe what happened next, in how your work was essentially attacked for the findings that you simply came up with from an examination of an immense amount of research on your own.
Right. Yeah. So I was mandated to do this research, so I did it. I reported it and published a paper on that. As soon as that paper was published, one of my greatest adversaries, Representative Joel Kretz, in Washington State, he's been trying to shut down my lab for some 10 to 15 years. Well, he jumped on this and did not like that paper at all, and contacted my university and demanded that the university do something, that I'm publishing this type of stuff in scientific journals, that the university stop me. So I was investigated by the university for misappropriation of funds in that particular incident in publishing that paper. However, I was exonerated by the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. They contacted my university and said, no, in fact, we contracted Dr. Wielgus to do this exact type of work, and he's doing what he should be doing, which is publishing his scientific research results that he's doing in collaboration with us. So I was saved in that case. But the efforts continued. Later on, Representative Kretz demanded that my research paper be examined for scientific misconduct. He thought that, well, this is bad, and this paper has to be retracted, or something has to be done with me. And again, so I was examined for scientific misconduct. By the Department of Statistics at Washington State University, and they reanalyzed my data, and at least to me, unsurprisingly, came to the exact same conclusion, that increased mortalities of wolves were indeed followed by increased livestock depredations the following year, and that has been published last year. However, no one seems to be speaking about that I was exonerated, and that my results were replicated, and the results have simply been buried.
You had another part of that research which was, I thought, really interesting and important in places like here in Yellowstone and Glacier and anywhere that livestock and wolves coexist, and that is that simple tools like fencing sheep and closely tending livestock with riders and such help considerably to reduce conflicts. Why don't you think those tools are used more? There seems to be absolutely bulletproof science, just like your other science, on that point.
Well, for example, one simple one. So I work with 10 different ranchers who cooperated with me, and we followed 10 different livestock herds. And for the most part, now all those 10 ranchers, because they cooperated with me and the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, were using best practices. So we monitored some 800 livestock. We radio collared 800 livestock from those 10 ranches over a period of 2 years. And we found that there were zero livestock mortalities due to wolves. Okay, when these ranchers were using best practices. And for example, one of those would be simply keeping livestock away from the immediate vicinity of a den site or a rendezvous site, because again, we know that breeding pairs and livestock on the den sites sometimes leads to livestock depredations. So these ranchers would simply, if we identify where the den site is and say, well, you should not graze in this particular pasture, and move to another pasture within your allotment, or perhaps even move to another allotment, and they did, and so we didn't see any livestock depredations at all. In another case, there was a rancher who refused to cooperate with me and to cooperate with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. And for example, he placed salt blocks in the immediate vicinity of the den site. And the livestock, of course, were then right on top of the wolves. And then the wolves started preying on livestock eventually. Any other rancher would have simply moved his cattle and his livestock away from the den site. This rancher refused to do so, and did not remove his livestock or the salt blocks until after the wolf kill program began. And so finally the salt blocks were removed because of fear of actually capturing cows in the leg hold traps that were set for wolves. And but the livestock remained, and that pack, that profanity peak pack, was wiped out. So again, the vast majority of ranchers that I dealt with were cooperative and used best practices, and we had no problems. But this one particular rancher, man, he really caused a great deal of consternation and their, the killing of the profanity peak pack, as well as 2 other packs as well. Same individual has been responsible for the elimination of 3 packs.
Wow.
I'm
That's
told that
stunning.
out of, I think it's 18 wolves killed in Washington State, this individual is responsible for 15 of the 18 being killed.
Well, it seems like despite the upholding of your research by other people who have examined your data, which you've described, the science that you produced really became weaponized by certain state legislators and certain administrators at Washington State University to sort of basically crush you. I mean, you had a gag order at one point. Your research money was taken away. Eventually, this large carnivore research lab, which was, one of the preeminent labs, I mean, there was nothing like it in the country, was shuttered. And why? I mean, it's Washington. It's not Wyoming. I mean, there are liberal people who care about why did this happen? Yeah,
that was a strange story, but again, Representative Joel Kretz has been trying to shut down my lab for some 10 to 15 years, and he had been unsuccessful. He complained to the university for a number of times, and complained to my university president, Elson Floyd, trying to get me fired, trying to shut down my lab for what I published on cougars and bears and indeed wolves. But what had happened then was, unfortunately, President Floyd passed away. And a new president came into Washington State University, and Representative Kretz contacted the new president and threatened that he would withhold funding for Washington State University's new medical school unless the university got rid of me and shut me up. And the new president, unlike President Floyd, immediately succumbed to this threat. It's unfortunate. I think it was a hollow threat, because I don't think any representative from Eastern Washington is really going to vote against a medical school in Eastern Washington. I think it was a hollow threat, but the new president apparently didn't. And so I was examined then for illegal use of state resources. They tried to fire me for that, and I was exonerated by that by the Board of Trustees. And they also charged me then with illegal political lobbying, contacting politicians, but that was part of my job as a state, lead researcher for wolf livestock. I had to produce things like annual reports, and of course politicians would get copies of them. So again, I was exonerated by that as well, by the Board of Regents. And so the Washington State University publicly denounced me and my work. Again, Representative Kretz demanded that they do so, and so they did, and they destroyed my reputation. And basically, in the end, my lab was shut down, and all the different graduate students and scientists and wildlife technicians and interns. We have perhaps as many as sometimes 20 people working in the lab. They were all let go, and the lab is now shut down. And I reached a legal agreement with the university that I would indeed resign, but they had to pay me out. I wasn't going to simply go away for free like they wanted me to do. They couldn't fire me, but we finally agreed to part ways.
Well, as news over the last couple of years reached ears of, around the country, of anybody who's interested in large carnivores, we're getting news about your fate and the deteriorating situation, and it sent chills down the spine of a lot of people. If such terrible things could happen to Dr. Rob Wielgus, at the height of his career, a scientist and such, who's published in the most prestigious journals there are, no other research studying controversial species or carnivores was safe, nor were principles of free speech or academic freedom. In your challenge of the behavior of Washington state administrators and these state legislators that you described, did you feel that you were carrying the weight of these broader principles on your shoulders?
Yeah, indeed. Science is, I like to say, science is my religion. Okay, so, that's what I do. I conduct science and I report the results, regardless of what they are. And these results, certain state representatives didn't like the results. They made that perfectly clear to the university. Unfortunately, universities are supposed to be the last bastions of academic freedom and scientific truth. And so usually, they're not influenced by immediate politics like that. And they're supposed to stand independently in the name of scientific truth. And in this case, the university didn't. It simply caved in to political pressure. And, that's something different. I've not seen that done before by a university, and I think other people were shocked nationally and internationally. That people were simply shocked that a university would cave in so quickly and so easily to special interest groups, like this state representative and the livestock people that he represented. So that was a real shame, and indeed, a lot of the other scientists at Wazoo were felt to be muzzled. My colleagues wouldn't even talk to me in the halls because, to be seen talking with me would have branded them as well. Right. And they were all afraid for their jobs as well. So it was pretty terrible. My grad students were terrified, and they were threatened that they wouldn't get their degrees. They were threatened that they had to shut up, that they couldn't talk to the media, that they couldn't talk to the public, and indeed that they couldn't even submit scientific papers to journals without the Dean of Agriculture vetting those papers. Oh my God. And so it put a huge chill on not only my lab, but the entire university. And I think the reputation of Washington State University has been irretrievably damaged because of what they did.
Well, getting back to our earlier conversation about your work on mountain lions, where you applied a lot of the same, approaches to that work, finding that hunting had adverse impacts above a certain level on depredations, and went to the political entities, including the governor of Washington, and they said, great. We're going to implement this. Sure. We're going to apply this as state policy.
Right.
So that it's another large carnivore with a very different result in the same state. Right. Using your work, applying similar approaches. What explains the difference, do you think, between what happens with wolves and, in this case, and mountain lions? Well,
the mountain lion work, I think, first and foremost, most people don't hate mountain lions, and a lot of people actually hate wolves. And wolves have also been much more politicized than mountain lions. Doing research on mountain lions is often simply doing research on mountain lions and reporting your results and ways on mitigating and preventing conflicts, so that was fine. But doing research on wolves, I found, was completely different than the research I'd done on grizzly bears and cougars. Everything with wolves was political. Wolves were basically the third rail. I was warned by a few other scientists who had studied wolves, and they told me that, Rob, if you study wolves, it's going to be your last job. You're either going to get fired or you're going to retire with severe stress-related issues. And I laughed them off, and I said, nah, I've worked on grizzly bears and black bears and cougars and have been enormously successful for some 35 years. So, yeah, I'm going to survive this. But indeed, they were right. The politics was completely toxic. It didn't matter what you said about wolves, you couldn't win. And if you reported the scientific truth on wolves, you're pretty much dead. The Republicans just nailed me big time for that. And they were willing to nail the university for that. It was a scorched earth policy. People wanted wolves dead, and that's all there was to it. So scientific truth, academic freedom, all of that stuff just went out the window.
What do you think it will take to change that dynamic? Because there are, the majority of the American public loves wolves. They just don't happen to live in agricultural lands in eastern Washington or Wyoming or Montana. Right.
Well, I'm hoping anyway that my scientific results, we're publishing that stuff now.
Yeah.
Now that, some people are assured that they won't lose their jobs because of publication. We're publishing that. And I'm hoping that the results will show, that we've shown that wolves and livestock can coexist using best practices, and that the wolf livestock losses are much less than what people feared. We found that wildfire and logging trucks and mastitis and all these other things accounted for way more livestock deaths than wolves.
Right.
Livestock deaths due to wolves was 3 out of 1,000. So 1/3 of 1%. And so it was a real minimal thing. Hopefully these results will get out and people will understand that it's all been really overblown. And that, it's not nearly, in reality, it's not nearly a big a problem. No one's going to go out of business because of wolf predation on livestock. That's simply not going to happen. And the losses even are minuscule compared to all the other losses. So hopefully education makes a difference. That's all I can do.
Right. Well, so I'm getting the sense here. I wasn't sure when we met this time where your mood would be, that maybe completely defeated and I'm just getting out of it, but that's not what I'm hearing. That you're still publishing papers and you've got an insight on the role of education and how to persevere. And is that where you are?
Yeah, I think science ultimately prevails. One politician used to jokingly call me Galileo. They
what happened to him?
Put me in the tower and that kind of thing. And Galileo was denounced.
Yeah.
But eventually, the scientific truth that he found came out, and I think the same will happen here. Science will win in the end. It takes much longer than what we hope. We wish that you could simply do the science and report it, and policies will change. But it's a slower process than that. Again, the science has to come out. It has to be replicated. It has to be shown over and over again, and we're showing that now. Then you have to educate the public, and then the public has to respond to the politicians. So basically, it's all about political change, and that takes a while. But I think there will be some political change, and politicians will eventually accept the scientific truth of what we found.
So, Rob, shifting gears, that here in Yellowstone we're facing, for the first time in 43 years, the prospects within a month or so of a grizzly bear hunt.
Right.
And you've certainly done your share of research on grizzly bears, and you've spoken up about this. And with the exception of a tiny sliver of land around Grand Teton Park where hunting will be banned by the state of Wyoming, hunting will occur everywhere outside the boundaries of Yellowstone and Grand Teton Parks.
Right.
What do you think the implications are for both grizzlies and for how we manage wildlife in this country?
Right. Well, I'll focus on some of the work that I've done on bears before. So I studied grizzly bears in Kananaskis Provincial Park, which you could think of as similar to our national park here. And what we found that when bears were killed outside of the park, So these are resident male bears, for example, and they live part of the time in the park, and they're fathers of cubs in the park. And when they were shot outside of the park, those males were replaced by new immigrant males, and those new immigrant males from elsewhere killed the cubs. And so that we found that hunting of bears outside of the park resulted in the deaths of cubs inside the park.
Right.
And so the idea there was what we needed was a buffer zone, a no hunting buffer zone around that park. And then later on we suggested 7 different grizzly bear preserves for British Columbia, protected bear populations. And indeed, in that case, we established no hunting boundaries around those reserves so that protected park bears would not be killed. I find it inconceivable that we don't have such a no hunting boundary around Yellowstone Park, because hunting of bears outside of the park will directly kill bears inside the park. These are park bears that are leaving the park for a period of time. They're simply going to be shot. And if you're killing male bears, park bears, their cubs will be killed because of infanticide. And so this is a terrible thing. It's an assault on protected park bears. This isn't really, because their home ranges are so large, these park bears spend a considerable period of time outside of the park, and they're simply not going to be protected anymore. I think the American people will completely disagree with this. I think everyone wants Yellowstone Park bears to be protected, and they don't want them to be shot, but they are going to be shot, and this is a travesty.
Yeah, we saw a very tragic episode in the recent months having to do with the superintendent of Yellowstone Park, who was standing up for precisely what you were speaking to, a buffer zone around the park. And also, he was absolutely firm on Wyoming not decreasing the size of the population. Wyoming is all about reducing the size of what most scientists feel is an already too small population, as well as isolated. And so here we have Yellowstone Park superintendent basically getting canned for speaking up not just for bears but for bison and other wildlife, and sending a chilling message to anyone in the Park Service who wants to stand up for science or simply the park resources.
Right, just telling the truth. It's similar to what happened to me. Telling the truth and expressing those facts results in one losing one's job in the current political climate. I mean, it's terrible. We're in an anti-science period right now. We're in a period of alternative facts, although there actually aren't. There isn't such a thing, and a fact is a fact. You can't have alternative facts, but people are talking about alternative facts, and if you state the scientific facts, you end up losing your job. And protected park bears are being killed because of it, and the will of the people, the American people, is being completely ignored because of it. And it's just in a real tragedy right now. I think we're in a super critical period where the wildlife and the American people are being downtrodden.
Absolutely. Disrespected as to their own values. So if you were talking to, like, the younger you, mucking around the woods and having fun in the land outside of Manitoba and looking at critters, or talking to young students who are thinking about getting into research and science, what would your recommendations be?
Well, my recommendations to my students and students, undergrad students, grad students, and all that thing was always saying, just report the facts, follow scientific truth, regardless of what they are, and that as a scientist you have to do that. That's your job. Otherwise, you shouldn't be a scientist. You shouldn't be a wildlife biologist. And so I've always followed that and told, my students to do that. I guess I've had, and it always worked. Prior to this wolf incident and my losing my job over it. So I've given it some greater thought, thinking, well, what do you do when, telling the truth results in your being canned? And, the scientist in me says, well, you still have to tell the truth. Because otherwise you're not doing your job as a scientist. You should be doing something else. I guess the emotional part of me tells students, tell the best you can without losing your job. I don't know, that's a real conundrum, and it's a conundrum that my students have had to live with. You know, full reporting and full timely reporting and one's career. Again, that we didn't have to worry about such things in the past, but now you have to. I don't know exactly what my recommendations are. I'm still thinking on that, what a young person should do. It was kind of okay for me to lose my job because I'm 61 years old, so I was pretty close to retirement anyway. But, you know, that would be an entirely different situation for someone who's in their mid-20s or mid-30s, and to lose their job and then be blacklisted like I was and become a pariah and then no longer have a career. You know, that's a whole different ball game. Yeah, I really don't have an answer for that right now.
Yeah. And the stress is enormous. I mean, even for you at your age, I mean, the stress of being under constant attack and never knowing what chunk of flesh they're gonna try to take out next, that's got to have a huge toll, and students who are facing that, yeah, it's got to be very, very difficult for them.
Yeah,
who are deeply interested in the future of these animals.
Sure, you know, it was really tough. It was tough on me, and it'd be tough on anyone who's going through that. You go through stress, and you lose your salary. Of course, you know, I lost my summer salary for a number of years. I lost all my travel funds, and so on and so forth. My children had to pay for it, and you know, they could no longer attend university, that type of thing. So my whole family suffered because of this, and people see that. And then they think, do I want to go there? You know, I could tell you right now, both of my daughters at one time expressed wanting to be wildlife biologists, and both of them no longer want to do so.
That's telling.
Yeah, it's real sad.
It is sad.
That, you know, that my daughters who wanted to be biologists are no longer interested because they saw what happened to me, and they saw what happened to them as well.
Yes.
Yeah. That's real sad.
Yeah. Probably followed in your footsteps around the woods and all kinds of things. And
you bet.
It. Yeah, absolutely.
Since they were
didn't have a choice.
Since they were little kids, they were up in grizzly country before they could even walk.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, what a great way to grow up, and so they'll find another path. But,
yeah, they'll be doing the outdoors, but they just won't be doing it professionally on the whims of some politician.
Well, thank you so much, Rob, for taking the time. We're talking to Dr. Rob Wielgus, formerly of Washington State University and one of the world's experts on wolves, mountain lions, and grizzly bears. And thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.